I'm recording this. We're going to have a discussion with Martin Fleischmann. We're at the ICCF-8 in Lerici, Italy, where the Cold Fusion Conference has been going on. A few months ago, he sent me a report that had a footnote about possible weapon applications related to cold fusion, and we wanted to get this on a tape recording and get further details about this, and therefore we're having this discussion. So I'd like to ask Martin Fleischmann about some of his ideas about possible weapons applications for the cold fusion phenomena.
Yes, well, Mel, I'm very pleased that we are able to have this discussion, or just exchange of information, especially as Stan Spark is writing a comprehensive report which contains an introductory section outlining the reasons why the work was started in the first place. Now, what Stan says is absolutely correct, but it's incomplete. And of course, I have been guilty of the same misdemeanors over the years. Most recently, in an article I sent to Scott Charm, where I trot out the well-worn raison d'etre of the research. Now, all those factors which led to the start up of this research, namely my search for systems which could only be explained by quantum electrodynamics, QED. That's all very true, but the overriding consideration was our involvement in what I call a necessary but not sufficient condition for developing DU shells, depleted uranium shells. And that work made me realize that looking at this whole thing with some degree of hindsight, that DU shells are probably the first example of weaponry which is dependent on QED. And with all the many different possibilities we had for initiating research projects, it is that really which pushed the cold fusion saga into the foreground. So I started off with the notion of trying to see whether one could develop a system which could be integrated into a working system. I didn't want to do this myself, but I think I felt it needed to be known. I was aware of other work being carried out, notably in the Soviet Union, and that made me all the more anxious to try and establish the boundaries of this particular subject. Shall I carry on? Or you want to say something?
I'll just say something. I guess a major concern as far as weapons goes is if weapons could be made small and were known to terrorists and they could be brought into the country easy, then that's certainly something that the country intelligence should know about, and that therefore we want to find out exactly what kind of weapons these might be.
Yes, I think I'll approach this somewhat obliquely. The system I had in mind, I should point out, I think at this point, that all this work was done on a need-to-know basis. I didn't tell people about all the bits and pieces which went into that. Although there are people who have guessed a very substantial part of this. This makes it all the more important, I think, for me to point out that this was behind this whole, this notion of trying to make a system which would have an abnormal energy release was part and parcel of this whole thing. Now, yes, the other point I should make is that quite early on we had an indication that you could get abnormal energy release. And that particular mishap, an accident which we really had, pointed the way, indicated that we should investigate the effect of pressure, high pressure, on dispersed materials, and that we could perturb we could have a series of perturbations, temperature perturbations, pressure perturbations, electric field perturbations, electromagnetic perturbations. And I felt that all of this had to be very carefully researched before any of this research came into the public domain. If, in fact, as you know, I was not at all keen for it to come into the public domain at all. I think perhaps it's best I carry on.
Yeah, go ahead and mention about some different metals that could be used.
Yes, yes. I mean, in '88 we were predominantly we wanted to get going on uranium-238, but of course we couldn't do this without informing the DOE and the Atomic Energy Authority in the United Kingdom, respectively. And we never really got into a meaningful into any sort of discussion with them. Of course, tantalum, niobium, titanium, these are all other options which one should investigate. And this question you raised, this question of scale, one is thinking of something which only weighs a few milligrams. Although the associated bits and pieces would probably take it into the gram range. Now, one reason, of course, why we never attempted this was because we didn't know the outcome, and we felt that such work had to be done in a totally secure environment, in a national research laboratory, well, in a nuclear research laboratory. But I think if I sort of go on now to the situation as we now find it, of course, there are other factors which we have to consider. At one stage it looked as though we would have an energy source without any harmful side effects. But the presence of positive feedback, of course, made us realize that that was a little bit of a delusion, that under certain conditions you might be able to get a very high energy release. So what we now know is we have a system which has a high energy release. It's subject to positive feedback. It obviously is a coherent system. So now the next set of questions which arises is what happens when we break the coherence. My own feeling is that under these conditions we put tritium, mainly tritium, but also neutrons. And of course, the question is, what are the defense implications of a compact, lightweight energy source?
Right.
That has to be spelled out, and we'll have to see what those implications might be, and also whether the deviation from coherent behavior would allow us to make a simple system for generating tritium. Now, I'm sure that such a system is of no interest to the United States, but we're not talking about the United States. We're talking about rogue elephants who might want to make tritium without a nuclear reactor. So I think there's a lot to worry us, and I hope your friends think very carefully about that. And of course, if they want to ask me some questions about it, I'll be glad to answer them. And again, if they want this to be totally confidential, it will be permanently suppressed.
At this meeting in Italy, the ICCF-8, I've noticed several papers coming out where they talk about using uranium as an electrode instead of palladium, and also titanium and other materials. So that other people in other countries are thinking of using other metals. In trying to get an idea of how this could be used as a weapon, I think if you loaded some metal heavily with deuterium and had it surrounded by explosives like RDX, that cause it to be compressed as well as heated up, then instead of getting small effects, you could it could lead to very large effects, perhaps. What do you think about that idea?
Well, yes, that was what we had in 1988. Well, we were warming up towards, warming up is the wrong thing to say. We were going that way, and we had in mind a dispersed powder of some material saturated with deuterium or tritium or some suitable mixture in a highly reducing environment, subjected to reserve battery type, missile type, battery type situation, where you heat it up and then compress it, and RDX, HMX or other nasties would be hollow charge compression was the obvious option. So I think having started this particular thing running, I'm sure your colleagues will know exactly how to do that, or what should be investigated. But we couldn't do that because we could never see our way to doing anything under a 2 kilogram of TNT equivalent per day, 2 kilogram of TNT equivalent. And of course, we couldn't possibly do that in a university laboratory.
You mentioned once that perhaps some of this work was done somewhere else. Would you want to comment on that or not? I'm thinking about the Cold Fusion Institute in Utah. Was that looked at somewhat in that laboratory?
No, it was not. I think that our colleagues in Utah had an idea to develop nuclear explosives for the mining industry, and they were looking at compression of metal deuterides in the 50 kilobar range with liquid explosives. But of course that's completely wrong. You have to have 10 megabar. You would aim to have 10 megabar. And a lot of this research could be done in a very straightforward way now, because not necessarily in that way. I think what you would do is do two-dimensional spectroscopy, where you compress a sample and look at the neutron spectra, for example. That would be one possibility, one option. And I think this was of interest in other countries. And one would really like to know exactly what has happened. And maybe your intelligence people will be able to collect a file together on that. If they did, I'd be very interested to read it.
It is my understanding that that Russia was doing some work in deuterated materials, and when Cold Fusion came out, they gave them an idea of maybe how this might work, but they were looking at similar systems even before the Cold Fusion announcement, to my knowledge at least. Would you want to comment on that?
It's very difficult to be sure, but I think if I had to guess who was doing it, I would certainly put the old Soviet Union at the head of the queue,
right,
because they had a program on the effects of extreme compression, which was, I think, our only number. They had space, nuclear weapons, and extreme compression as their three top-line options. So one would have to really be quite sure. One would have to try and see what exactly they did and what the purpose was. Whether it'll ever be released, I don't know. I did try to get hold of this information incidentally, but I got a little. I'm an amateur spook.
Right. Yeah.
But I got nowhere with that. Now, maybe I'm too amateur, but I thought I had a good line on it at one stage. But it went sour on me.
Another area that has not been explored is the use of tritium in metals as well as deuterium. And I have not seen anything at any conference on that yet, but of course tritium is hard to get hold of and hard to investigate except under certain situations, but that might lead to even larger effects perhaps. What do you think about that?
Of course. And Stan Pons and I did propose to the university that we should either go to Oak Ridge or Los Alamos for 2 years to, especially Los Alamos, to try and get into the tritium cells to do those experiments. But the university wasn't having it, so that didn't happen. So I'm afraid it's a very bad story. Really, I'm sure that in retrospect people say that Stan and I were right, that this shouldn't have seen the light of day. But there's nothing we can do about it now. It was forced into the open. The DOE had their chance to classify it, and they didn't. So here we are.
It's probably just a matter of time before other countries realize possible applications of some of this technology in cold fusion, and I think it's important the United States to be aware of that and maybe do some experiments and find out what is there before a third world country comes up with it and surprises us with a new small-scale weapon that can be easily brought into the country. I think that's what we're trying to prevent if we can.
Yes, well, I mean, that is terrorism is a very big problem we have to confront now. But a small-scale weapon would be useful in conventional warfare. You have to bear that in mind as well. So I think we just have to have a program to delineate this. Of course, there are all sorts of other options. If you see what people are doing now, if you see what people are talking about, trying to set up a theoretical framework which allows them to predict what happens when the channels, the outgoing channels, go in certain directions. Of course that has to be done. We have to see what happens. Manhattan 2, we have to. Really, but we're not going to get Manhattan 2. But let's just get Manhattan 1.1.
Yeah. So I would think that, in summary, that if you have deuterium in metals and then you perturb it with either high temperature or high pressure or electric fields or magnetic fields, this is what could maybe trigger a larger effect, and that's probably what needs to be investigated, is what happens in deuterated materials under these more extreme conditions.
Yes, we need a program on unconventional effects in deuterated and tritiated materials.
Right.
And here I would say that a lot of this could be written in such a way that nobody would know what it was about.
Right.
And I think that some of that could then be channeled into the university sector or commercial institutions, while the really dodgy bits should be done in Los Alamos or China Lake or something.
Right. So what I'll do when I get back to the United States, I'll pass this tape on to a person who's already contacted me, and she says she has contacts to give it on further, and we'll just see what happens. I guess that's all we can do at this stage. Do you have any further comments?
No, I think as scientists we just have to give the best advice we can. We should not concern ourselves with political or sociological questions, although people are prone to do that. But I don't think we should. We should just give advice or do research on the systems which are of interest. Period.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Martin Fleischmann, and when I get back to the U.S., I'll pass this tape on, and we'll just wait and see what happens. Okay.
Jolly good. Thank you very much.
Right. First stop.
I think that was probably a downside better than the previous round.
Okay. Yeah.
More focused than
Yeah.
I was rather worried
sociological questions, although
always make sure it works.
Yeah.
I thought we had to take out the Gulf War.
Yeah.
Because that would put the wind up.
Yeah. I guess I don't understand the Gulf War. It's not just using armor-piercing depleted uranium. I guess it's not just that.
No, they had lots of other things going on.
Right. So they had some probably new weapon systems that might have produced neutrons. Is that?
Well, they may be totally unconnected.
Yeah. Right.
They may have had neutron contamination
Right. Yeah.
and armor-piercing shells, and the two things are not connected.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But you are not privy to any of that. I'm not privy to that.
Yeah, where I work is the need to know. If you don't have a need to know, you don't know. You
don't know.
You don't know it.
Well, yeah, I had this top flight guy come in and say, "We want you to do this." I said, "You really want it?" "Yes, we'll do it tomorrow."
Yeah.
Have you switched it off?
Well, do produce energy and some produce none whatsoever.
He wrote in a report for the Navy regarding a possible weapons application of cold fusion.
Yes, well, I'm glad we have this chance to talk. When I looked at your data, I put some footnotes on, which I was very uneasy about, because I have never really disclosed all the reasons why we started this research. And all this is brought more into focus by the fact that Stan Spaak is writing an introduction. And that, of course, everything he says is absolutely true, but it is only part of the story. And the missing piece is perhaps the piece we should talk about, which is hidden behind those, I think, footnotes E11 and E12 in the report I said to you.
Right. Okay, could you expand a little bit on those footnotes? Are about some previous work you've done, and I remember one time you told me perhaps there are 4 different ways this could be used in weapons applications. Some of the ideas relating to cold fusion.
Well, I think here I must tell you that a long time ago we worked on a necessary but not sufficient condition to implement depleted uranium shells.
Right.
And my involvement with that research convinced me that there had to be a range of possible applications of, well, let me say, if I look back on this with hindsight, of course it is more clear than it was in the early 1980s. So, but I think it is a waste of time to try and reconstruct how we thought of it in the 1980s. I do have to look at it with a certain degree of hindsight. So if you will forgive that, I mean, you might have to clear up what was hindsight and what we actually thought at the time, what I actually thought at the time. And it seemed to me, or seems now, so it's not quite clear to what extent we should separate those two, that one had to, that the advent of depleted, let's call them DU shell technology, showed that there had to be a range of possible applications of quantum electrodynamics to create a new set of devices. And it was also not clear to me to what extent those ideas would have to be involved in fission and fusion weaponry. Now, I don't know how fission and fusion weapons work, but I realized that some of the things which were being done in connection with DU shells certainly had a bearing on fission and fusion weapons technology. So I don't know whether you want to add something at this stage.
No, just go ahead and keep talking. I want to make sure it is still playing. I want to check that. And you're getting it on the video.
Yeah.
My wife Linda is also recording on the video, and
it seems to be okay.
Right, it seems to be okay right now. Right.
Well, with the passage of time, of course, my feeling about that has sharpened up rather, because I'm not the only person who's concerned about the desert war syndromes, the consequences of using DU shells. But anyway, the important point at that stage was that if you could develop highly loaded, if you could develop metals highly loaded with deuterium and subject them to perturbations, you might achieve explosive devices. That is one of the key possible applications. The question, what we used to call uncontrolled release of thermal energy.
So pressure would be one thing?
Well, pressure would be the number one. Would be the number one candidate. Now, as we did this work, of course, you know, we had one accident.
In Salt Lake City?
In Salt Lake City, we had an accident.
After you turned the experiment off, as I recall. Right?
Reduced the current density, and the whole thing boiled out about 500 cubic centimeters of heavy water, and melted the electrode and dropped through the base of the cell and went into the concrete.
It took out the base of the table, went through the table.
Right? And into the concrete.
Right.
Now, of course, if we had known more about the system, we would have scraped everything up and preserved it, but as it was, we just changed the methodology to try and make sure we wouldn't get this sort of event again.
What happened to the palladium from that experiment?
Well, God only knows. I don't know what happened to it. This is a terrible embarrassment to me. But we changed the methodology in order to make sure that we wouldn't get this sort of event again.
That was in a cubic shape.
It was a sort of basically approximately a centimeter cubed of palladium.
And that is, you think, a dangerous configuration?
Well, we avoided it.
Right, yeah. Okay.
You know, we didn't know enough about it, so we avoided it. But let me. Well, the point about that was not that in itself would have a weapons implication.
Right.
But it pointed the way that you could possibly perturb the system in a variety of ways in order to create a weapons configuration.
Right.
you see.
Yeah.
And of course, knowing what I did about DU shells,
Right.
that you have to realize that that also had a bearing on it.
Right.
So one of the possible applications, of course, of this methodology, and I was also somewhat connected with Star Wars, I should also tell you that, and it seemed to me that that this way one might be able to make very compact devices with a very high energy yield.
Very small devices. Mm-hmm. And the problem there that they could be easily brought into country undetected.
Oh, well, they would be quite undetectable.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah.
This would be, I mean, there is a terrible terrorism
right, yeah.
Aspect to this.
Right.
But also, if one thinks of the original objectives of Star Wars, of course, it would be very useful to have miniaturized devices with a big explosive force.
Right,
it's quite clear that is one of the things one would like to have.
Right.
So my concerns about the DU shells and the ramifications of that were in the end, for me, the deciding factor which led to the initiation of this research.
Oh.
My wife is very unhappy because she thinks there is something like that in my mind. I have never told her this.
Oh.
But you see, other people think so too.
Right.
You know, other people suspect that this was an important factor. So gradually, as time goes on, of course, people will suspect it more and more and more. I won't talk to them, needless to say.
Have you spoken to anybody else about this possibility? Like you told me once, you didn't even discuss this with Stan Pons.
I did not discuss it with Stan Pons.
Yeah.
My relationship with Stan Pons was on the basis of need to know. It was not necessary for him to know this. So
right.
I thought to protect him, really, it should be on a need to know basis.
Did he ever bring it up?
No, he did not bring it up, but he may well have suspected it.
Right, yeah.
The only person I have discussed it with is one person who suspected it anyway.
Right. And who was
He's
that?
dead.
Oh, okay.
I got him.
You know, that's
right, yeah.
The chain is broken.
Okay, right.
Well, of course, there are other possible weapons implication, and one of them being the question of whether you can make tritium or not.
Right.
Now, nobody's ever asked me about that. I think you can make tritium. I wouldn't set about it the way other people have done it, but I would.
Yeah.
If somebody asked me how would you make it? How would you devise?
Would you change the conditions of?
Of course. In roughly speaking, tritium is observed in a non-steady state as you
right.
charge things up,
yeah.
and also I think it is observed when you have some.
Water might be a key.
The
tritium.
We were going to do this in 1990. We had boiling cells and we were going to control the addition of light water.
Right.
But then, as you know, they wouldn't order the heavy water, so the whole experiment collapsed.
Right. Yeah.
And we never had the opportunity to reconstruct it, and I did not feel inclined to reconstruct it when we were in France.
But it could prove to be a method of producing tritium in larger quantities.
Well, you always get tritium in the non-steady state in electrodiffusion systems, for example.
Yeah.
So if you wanted, I think the work at Los Alamos points that way as well.
Yeah. By
So
Tom Plater.
Tom Taylor's work points that way.
Right.
So if one wanted to make tritium, one would clearly have to use electrodiffusion in a non-steady state in the presence of light water, and that could be researched if that was one of the objectives.
Yeah.
If one wanted to make explosive devices, then equally one could. It's pretty clear what would have to do. You'd probably also use electrodiffusion devices subjected to pressure shocks.
If you did electrolysis and loaded palladium with deuterium to a high level, then had explosives around it to compress it and pressurize it.
It's very much like the DU shell.
Right, yeah, right. That would be one possible way it might
That's
work.
where you start. Now, the reason I've never done it is I think your colleagues don't like the notion that I know about boomed boxes and boomed rooms.
Yeah,
but you'd have to do it in a secure environment,
right.
and I could never see my way. I don't think you would get 2 kilograms of TNT equivalent,
right.
but if it really went wrong, you would have to budget for designing experiments which would be okay in a 2 kilogram of TNT equivalent basis, and I think that means a boom box in a boom room.
Right. How big of a rod is palladium would you
It could be
say?
2 centimeters of a 50 micron wire.
Okay, yeah. That's
It's
all you
nothing.
would need, right?
It's absolutely nothing.
Right, yeah.
And I don't know what the ramifications of this would be. Equally, I don't know whether you'd use palladium. I mean, a very high target would be uranium deuteride.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But, UD, in fact, in 1988, Stan and I wanted to have a look at UD3,
Right, yeah.
238 uranium D3.
Right.
But in order to do that, we had to disclose our intentions to the DOE.
Right,
We
yeah.
started these negotiations, but as you know, this came to nothing.
Right, yeah.
So this is, well, it may have been done by other people, but we have certainly not done
Yeah,
that.
right.
So if people wanted to do this, this is one, you would start, certainly you would do it palladium, you certainly would try and modify DU shells
Yeah.
to see what you would get there.
Yeah.
And of course in my cynical moments, I just cannot believe that people would not have modified the DU shells.
Right.
I don't know what you think about that.
I've
I
wondered,
mean, it's such an obvious thing
yeah, I
to
wondered
do.
about that. Just doing the cold fusion experiments using uranium as a cathode, for example, and seeing what you would get in those conditions.
Well, it would probably fracture
Right, yeah.
intensely. So I think
Right.
that the methodology one would use there is to use powder DUD3 to start off with.
Yeah.
It's subjected to an intense compression.
Right.
Of course, there were compression experiments done in Salt Lake City.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, they were done with liquid explosives, and they were in the 50 kilobar range.
This is, what year was this?
80, 89,
89.
89, 90.
They kept that pretty quiet, I guess.
That is very surprising, how
Yeah.
quiet. Now, they kept results quiet from us as well, but it seemed to me
Who did that work?
Wadsworth, Milt Wadsworth.
Oh, okay.
His group.
At the Cold Fusion Institute.
Well, Milt Wadsworth hit on this terrible idea of using cold fusion explosives in the mining industry.
Right.
And I said to Stan Pons, he needs this like a hole in the head.
Right, yeah.
But they did some experiments with liquid explosives. And I think, the little I saw of the results seemed to indicate that they were getting nuclear effects.
Yeah.
But of course the pressure range was incorrect. You have to be in the 10 megabar region.
Yeah.
And the way you would do that is with HMX RDX or something,
Yeah.
all of those things.
Which China Lake has
Yes.
expertise in.
Yes,
Right.
yes. You'd
Right.
use, this was all the stuff used during the war to make fission weapons.
Yeah.
You'd use those to compress UD3. Now, I just can't credit, but in my more sane, or shall we say insane moments, if I pose the question to myself, can people not have done this?
Right, yeah.
I just don't think
Yeah.
can't see it. I think they must surely have tried it.
Yeah.
To not try it seems criminally negligent.
To my knowledge, nobody in the Navy has tried this. At least I don't know about it. I think maybe I would, but I'm not sure.
Well, maybe it already exists.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the terrible uncertainty about Gulf War syndrome.
Yeah.
A lot of evidence of the Gulf War syndrome looks like low-level neutron irradiation.
Yeah.
Lots of people have spotted that one.
Yeah.
Where would they come from? Not from U-238.
Low level,
Neutron irradiation.
just low level neutron.
Yes,
Right,
that's
yeah.
what the Gulf War syndrome looks like.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That can't come from U-238.
Right.
So is there something else in there?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And that was something Iran might have had.
No, I think the U.S.
Oh, the
British.
US? Yeah. Oh, because some of the U.S. soldiers suffered from that. I guess. Right. Right.
Well, that is the connection which other people are making.
Right. So you take.
I think your colleagues, the intelligence agencies, should be aware that there are other people who are making that connection.
Right. Yeah.
So if this is true, if it is not true, all very well and good. If it is true, then it will certainly come out at some stage.
Right.
And that is a matter which has to be dealt with politically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
As scientists, we can't uninvent what
Right.
we have done.
Yeah.
and that connection will be made, and that has to be dealt with politically.
Right. Yeah.
That's my view.
So uranium deuteride would be one system to consider, and it would be a powder, right?
Well, I think there are
UD3.
various configurations.
Right, yeah.
I think if you and I got together, we could soon knock up one or two
Right.
test systems,
Yeah.
which we could, if we could get access to a firing range somewhere,
Right.
we could test out.
Right.
Really.
Right.
I'm perfectly willing to do that. And incidentally, I should tell you here that I have signed the Official Secrets Act. And if the consequence of this state is that someone says, well, that's all, that's very interesting, you now have to keep your mouth shut about that.
Yeah.
That's all right by me too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And Stan and I never wanted to publish this in the first place. Now, this we can see why we didn't want to publish it.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of reasons why we thought this matter should not get into the public domain until one was absolutely sure that there was absolutely no weapons implication.
Right. Yeah.
That we don't know. That we should find out right now. Like last year or 10 years ago, we should find it out.
Yeah. I just wonder if other countries might be looking at this. But we don't know.
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah. Yeah.
It would be a miracle if we hadn't thought of
Yeah.
it.
Right.
Really.
For example, China.
Well, yes.
Right.
Or Japan.
Right. Yeah.
Or anybody.
Right. Yeah.
Korea.
Right.
Well, you know, we as scientists, you have worked on the weapons space. I've done a lot of weapons-related research in my time, which nobody knows of my involvement in various programs.
Because you worked on some secret programs in England.
Well, no, you're not that secret,
Right, yeah.
but you know, you didn't know that I'd worked on BU shells.
No.
Who knows about it?
Because you didn't publish that.
No.
Right.
No. You cannot check.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Now, this is becoming ever more public, and people are using other metals. Sooner or later, they'll use uranium deuteride.
Right.
It's only a question of time
Yeah.
before it all leaks out.
Right.
Now, hopefully, there's nothing there.
If there were something, what would you predict? Would it be radiationless, like cold fusion?
Well, my first bet would be very low levels of radiation, but intense release of heat.
Right. Yeah. And what about neutrons?
Well, some,
Yeah.
because in non-steady state, you'd have some neutrons and some
Right.
neutrons.
Yeah.
That's what I would guess would happen.
Yeah. Now, pressure is one way you can perturb the system, but what
Electric
about
fields.
electric fields is another? Magnetic fields?
Yes.
Possibly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or any combination of those perturbations.
Right, yeah. What about temperature? But
Yes.
temperature is like an explosive would be both pressure and temperature.
Well, we alluded to one possibility when we wrote to the DOE in 1988. We said if you had powdered palladium deuteride dispersed in metal hydride tritide
Right, yeah.
mixtures and raise the temperature with a reserve battery, like a missile battery, what would happen to it?
Right,
That's one we actually alluded to.
right,
A temperature perturbation of powdered materials.
right. And that involved tritium?
Well, it could be deuterium or tritium or any isotopic mixture you found desirable. So temperature perturbation certainly, pressure perturbation certainly, electric field certainly, magnetic more doubtful, but electric field certainly, or combinations of those three. So you have in fact 6 possibilities to start off with. You have to consider.
Well, what about loading a metal with tritium? I don't think anybody reported on that.
Well, you know, Stan and I wanted to go to work in Los Alamos for 2 years,
Right.
and one of our objectives would have been to go into the tritium cells if
Right.
we had got clearance
Yeah.
to investigate how the whole system would behave in the tritium.
And tritium and deuterium mixtures.
Yes,
Right,
indeed.
Right, yeah, right,
But that came to nothing.
right.
Now, I can understand that. I mean, if this was ever discussed by the defense establishment or the intelligence agencies, they said, well, okay, there are these 2 lunatics, they want to do this, why should we let them loose on this?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Especially with all the controversy going on in
Indeed.
89.
Indeed.
Right.
But I think these things have to be I think as we stand now, we see that other people are going to other metals, they're going to powders, you know.
Like yesterday, several people spoke about uranium, using uranium in the meeting yesterday.
Yes, and powders.
Right.
They'll put all this together.
Right.
So it's only a question of time before they do it.
And Makubri today was using
Powders.
Right.
Arata in Japan used powders.
Right.
Did this just come out of the blue?
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Right.
It's not an obvious thing you would do.
Yeah, it's obvious you would try these variations.
Yes.
It's obvious people would try things like uranium and powders. This is a matter of time.
I think the thing, if you stand back and say, here are these lunatics, they've talked about palladium, what would you really do? You'd use uranium and you would use, come on, I've lost it now.
Other metals?
Well, you'd use other niobium tantalum.
Yeah.
You'd use uranium and you'd use the deuterides and you'd use powders and you'd try perturbations.
Right.
That surely is so obvious that doesn't need to say it really.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, there we are.
And to use
God almighty mess, yes.
and to use explosives like
Semtex,
and that's
RDX, HMX.
right. Yeah.
And we had a program on nitrating different things and we stopped it. We made some dreadful things.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah. China Lake does a lot of research on new explosives.
We had an N205 program, you see.
Right.
We made N205 on the cheap. Incidentally, the people at Lawrence Livermore know all about this.
Right.
So,
with controlled explosives to keep the pressure uniform.
Hollow charge compression.
Right. Yeah. That would be the most obvious thing to try, I think. Would it not?
Well, if I were you in China Lake and people were not so against the whole thing, I would say, well, the obvious thing for us to try is to do a whole charge compression of UB3.
Right. Yeah.
Or PD something or another.
Yeah.
Just see what happens.
Right. Yeah.
Measure the thermal yield and just put a few Newton counters around.
Right. And that should not be too expensive a test to do.
No, it's not an expensive test, and also even an unreliable Newton counter will do.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's only a pressure wave.
Right. See, my concern is
Electrically quiet.
if China Lake or somebody in the United States doesn't do that, other countries are going to do it eventually, I think.
Well, my having this conversation with you makes me say,
Yeah.
I think it would be absolutely insane for the people in the States not to try this.
Right. Yeah.
At one stage I wrote to, I didn't really put it the same way I said it, but I wrote one of my letters to the DOE. I said, it is up to us to find out what goes up. Us spelled big U-S.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want, we don't want this to fall, we don't want to be surprised by anybody.
Yeah. What about United Kingdom? Does
I have no idea.
The military there has any interest, or do you know?
I meet a blank wall of pretended indifference.
Right. Yeah.
But I suspect that some of this must have been talked about.
Right. Yeah.
I do probe when I have an opportunity.
Yeah.
And the outcome of my probing is zero reply.
Right.
Which means that I'm touching a wrong nerve, obviously somewhere.
Yeah, that's similar to my probing with the Navy. I discussed this at the meeting in Washington D.C. last November, but I didn't get any reply back.
Well, I think the intelligence agencies will never reveal what they're really worried about.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't think we should urge them to release that information. They should just get on with the job, really.
But somebody should test some of these concepts out.
Indeed. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And if they want us to keep quiet, they should say, well, now you keep quiet.
Right. And we will do it.
Yes.
But if they want us to help in testing, we will do that.
If they want our assistance, we'll help.
Right. Yeah.
We don't want a military application. You know, I started off thinking that there would only be military applications.
Right.
And then it seemed that the civilian applications, that it was a way of having only civilian applications. Well, I didn't actually believe that. That's the way I presented it to other people.
Right.
But I have never believed that.
Right. Yeah. So when you mentioned one time there were four different weapons applications, we've discussed the compression, explosive compression.
Explosive compression.
Electromagnetic fields is another
Yes.
one. Right.
Thermal sources.
What was that?
Compact thermal sources.
Right.
I mean, the heat after death reveals
yeah.
that you must be able to make compact thermal sources.
Yeah, right.
It's quite clear.
Right.
that your military colleagues will know what the applications of compact thermal sources would be in the battlefield. And power generation. I mean, in my jocular vein, I said we will build you. I was going to build a neutrino detector. We'll detect all the submarines with nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors, and then we will build you a propulsion system which does not release neutrinos.
Right.
I think once I had the comment, what makes you think we want to have that?
Right.
I said, bully. Bully to you. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
You don't want it.
Right. Yeah.
You prefer to see all the submarines.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Anyway, there you are. This is my soul laid bare.
Okay.
But I just wanted to tell you, I did really, the final straw, in the final thing which persuaded me to do it was the weapons aspect.
Yeah. Right. And
I did not intend to save the world.
right. Yeah.
Just almost.
But you don't want to add,
Almost.
You don't want to add the weapons to destroy the world either.
I don't want that, and I don't
Right.
want terrorist weapons either.
Yeah. Right.
So let's see what this produces.
Okay.
Nothing.
Well, maybe nothing that we hear about,
No, that's okay by me.
but that doesn't mean there'll be. Even though we don't hear about it, doesn't mean nothing will be done.
No, it's okay by
Right,
me
yeah,
too.
right,
But
yeah.
there are some very well-defined experiments which could be set up, which
Yeah.
wouldn't cost a lot of money.
Yeah. And somebody should do them pretty soon
Somebody should do them next week.
if they haven't done them already.
Bush will get
That's
in and we'll send this to him, and then he'll appropriate the money, and then that'll solve the problem.
Who?
Bush.
Bush.
He's running for president, the son of President
Well,
Bush.
yeah, I mean, these guys, they should know how to do these things.
Yeah.
They should, huh?
But the main thing, it'll get into the Navy, and it'll be passed on in the Navy until somebody will at least know what we said. And if they don't do anything, then it's their fault, not our fault. I feel
That's
like
okay.
Right, yeah.
If it's not my fault, that's okay too.
Right.
But I did once, I must tell you,
Go ahead, keep going.
I did raise the question of the explosive compression of things
Right.
at the NSF meeting with someone.
Right.
And the comment was, well, by all means, if you want to do that, you come down to Albuquerque. What is the big Air Force base there?
Kirtland.
Kirtland. Kirtland, they've got places where you could try this out.
Right.
But I dropped it
Right. Yeah.
and let it die.
Sandia National Laboratory is nearby too.
Sure, we could do it down in Kirtland or somewhere.
Right. Yeah. And maybe China Lake. It has
China Lake.
It has plenty of room.
China Lake, we could do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Right. So we'll pass this on through the Navy and
Do that.
and we'll see what happens. Okay. Thank you for your comment.
Okay,
Right.
it's a pleasure.
Okay. Now I push stop. Right?
Stop.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
That's a condensed version.
A condensed version.
A highly condensed version of the thing. Sheila hates. She
You
says,
wanna-
how can you possibly work on something which might have weapons
You want
application?
to rewind and then
Oh, you mean she,
check it a little bit?
your
She
wife
said,
your wife
she
doesn't.
said, how can you work on something which